Picture this. You're looking out your window on a night so cold the moon itself seems to shiver in the ink-black sky. The wind howls a lonely, mournful song, a predator stalking the deserted streets of your town. From your position of warmth and authority, you see two small figures, no bigger than bundled shadows, huddled against the wall of the house across the street. They are children, twin girls, with hair the color of spun moonlight and faces pinched with a cold that seeps deeper than bone. Their father, a man whose heart is as barren as the winter landscape, has locked them out. Again, this isn't discipline. This is a ritual of cruelty, a slow, methodical breaking of a spirit. You are Mayor Elias Vance, a man who has built this town, Prosperity Gulch, from dust and determination. The law is a tool in your hands, but tonight, it feels like a cage. What do you do when a father's legal right becomes a child's living nightmare? What action do you take when the coldest place in town isn't the heart of the blizzard, but the heart of a man? Elias Vance watched from the window of his mayoral office, which also served as his solitary home. The lamplight cast a warm, golden pool on his oak desk, littered with town charters and land deeds. But the glow could not reach the cold knot tightening in his stomach. He was a man shaped by loss, a widower whose own child had been taken by a fever years ago, a memory that winter always sharpened into a blade. That was why this spectacle cut him so deeply. He had first noticed it a week ago, a flicker of movement in the frigid twilight. He'd thought it was a trick of the eye, a pair of deer straying too close to town. But then he saw them clearly. Two little girls, their threadbare coats offering pathetic defense against the biting air, their arms wrapped around each other in a desperate, silent pact of survival. Their father, Jedediah Thorne, a man with a disposition as sour as last year's cider, would stand silhouetted in the doorway for a moment, a monolith of indifference, before shutting and bolting the door, plunging them into the frozen darkness. The first night, Elias had told himself it was a one-time punishment, however harsh. The second, a disturbing pattern. By the third night, a cold fury, colder than the wind outside, had taken root in his soul. He knew Jedediah. The man was a bitter weed, soured by a failed mining claim and the departure of his wife, a woman who had fled his cruelty months earlier, leaving her daughters behind. Thorne saw his children not as daughters to be cherished, but as burdens to be endured, reminders of his own perceived failures. He was a man who used fear as currency, and his own home was his grim kingdom. Elias knew the law. A man's home was his castle, his children his property, according to the unwritten, brutal code of the frontier. To interfere was to invite trouble, to challenge a man's authority in a place where such challenges were often answered with violence. But to do nothing felt like a betrayal of his own humanity, a sin against the ghost of the child he could not save. He watched them now, Alara and Lyra. He had learned their names from Martha, the town baker, a woman whose kindness was the town's true hearth. She spoke of them in hushed, worried tones. "They are good girls, Mayor, quiet as church mice. They have their mother's eyes." Their eyes, Elias thought, were like two pairs of bruised violets, wide with a fear that no child should ever know. He saw them shiver, a violent, uncontrollable trembling that shook their small frames. Their breath plumed in the air, tiny ghosts of warmth escaping into the void. They didn't cry. That was the most heartbreaking part. It was as if their tears had long since frozen inside them, leaving only a hollow, stoic endurance. Elias's hand clenched on the windowsill. The wood groaned under the pressure. Every instinct screamed at him to storm across the street, to break down that door and gather those children into the safety of his arms. But he was the mayor. His actions had to be measured, deliberate. A misstep could make things infinitely worse for them. Jedediah could pack them up and disappear into the wilderness, where no one would ever hear their silent suffering again. So he began his campaign not with a gavel, but with a gesture. He strode to his own porch, his boots crunching on the pristine snow. He placed a thick wool blanket, one his late wife had woven, on a bench near the street, along with a thermos of hot broth he'd prepared. He didn't call out to them. He simply left the offering and retreated back into the shadows of his office, watching. For a long time, the girls didn't move. They stared at the offering as if it were a trap. Finally, hesitantly, one of them, Lyra, the bolder of the two, crept forward. She snatched the blanket and the thermos and scurried back to her sister. They huddled together, wrapping the heavy wool around their shoulders. Elias watched as they drank the broth, the steam warming their pale faces. It wasn't a rescue. It was a reprieve. A single flickering candle in an overwhelming darkness. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his marrow, that it would not be enough. The storm was coming, both on the horizon and in the heart of that dark house, and he would have to become the shield they so desperately needed. The following days settled into a tense, unspoken rhythm. Each evening, as the sun bled out behind the jagged peaks, Elias would place his offering on the porch bench. A blanket, hot soup, sometimes a piece of bread and jam left over from his supper. And each evening, the girls would wait until they believed he wasn't watching before retrieving it. Their movements quick and furtive, like forest creatures stealing from a campsite. They never looked toward his window. They never acknowledged the source of the nightly miracle. Their fear of their father was a wall around them, and Elias understood that to breach it too quickly would only cause it to crumble down upon them. He began to learn their silent language. Alara was the watcher, her gaze constantly flitting toward her own front door, her body coiled with a permanent tension. Lyra was the protector, always positioning herself slightly in front of her sister, the one who would brave the few feet of open space to grab the food and blanket. During the day, he would see them on their way to the small, one-room schoolhouse, their hands clasped tightly together. They walked with their heads down, their shoulders hunched, as if trying to make themselves smaller, to disappear into the landscape. Elias tried to engage Jedediah Thorne directly. He met him at the general store, feigning a casual encounter. "Thorne," Elias began, his voice level. "Harsh winter we're having. It's important we look after our own Jedediah." A gaunt man with eyes like chips of flint turned slowly. His face was a mask of resentment. "I look after what's mine, Mayor," he sneered, his voice low and gravelly. "My property is my business." The emphasis on the word property was a deliberate barb. "They're children, Jedediah, daughters, not livestock to be left in a cold pen." Elias fought to keep the tremor of rage from his voice. Jedediah's lips curled into a cruel smile. "They need toughening. The world ain't a warm office and a soft chair, Vance. It's hard. It's cold. I'm teaching them what they need to survive." He leaned closer, his breath smelling of stale tobacco. "And I'd advise you to mind the business of the town and stay out of the business of my family. Some fences are best left unmended." The threat was veiled, but unmistakable. Elias saw the townsfolk nearby lower their eyes, pretending not to hear. They were afraid of Thorne's temper, and they were accustomed to minding their own affairs. This was a private matter, a family matter. But Elias could see the truth. This wasn't family. It was tyranny. His conversation with Thorne had only made things worse. That night, the girls were cast out earlier than usual, and there was no offering on Elias's porch. He saw Thorne watching from his window, a sentinel of spite, daring him to interfere. Elias's heart hammered against his ribs. He had been a fool. He had provoked the beast, and now the children were paying the price. He waited for hours, his gaze locked on the two small forms across the street, until Thorne finally extinguished his lamp and, presumably, went to bed. Only then did Elias dare to venture out. He moved quickly, a ghost in the moonlight, and delivered a double portion of soup and 2 blankets. As he turned to leave, one of the girls, Alara, looked up. For the first time, her eyes met his across the frozen street. There was no gratitude in her gaze, only a deep, bottomless ocean of terror. She wasn't just afraid of her father. She was afraid of the attention, of the disruption, of the hope that his kindness represented. Because hope was a dangerous thing in a world as cruel as hers. It was a lesson he knew she had learned over and over. That night, sleep offered Elias no escape. He dreamt of his daughter, her small hand growing cold in his, and he awoke with a gasp, the phantom chill still clinging to him. He knew he was running out of time. The whispers of the old trappers and miners in town were all the same. The worst storm in a decade was rolling in from the north, a white behemoth of snow and ice that would swallow the world. The sky had already taken on a bruised, purplish hue. The wind had a new, sharper edge to its voice. This storm would not be a hardship. It would be a killer. And Elias knew, with a chilling premonition, that Jedediah Thorne would see it not as a threat, but as an opportunity. An opportunity to finally break his daughters, or to be rid of them for good. The law had failed. The community had failed. Now there was only him. He was no longer acting as mayor. He was acting as a man, a protector, bound by a moral law that was older and more absolute than any charter written on paper. The storm arrived not with a roar, but with a suffocating whisper. Fine, granular snow began to fall, swirling in hypnotic patterns under the gas lamps that lined Prosperity Gulch's main street. The wind, which had been a steady moan for days, now rose to a shrieking wail, clawing at the window panes of Elias's office like a hungry beast. The temperature plummeted. It was a cold that felt personal, an invasive force that sought out every crack and crevice, every ounce of warmth, and extinguished it. Elias stood at his window, a sentinel at his post, his entire being focused on the house across the street. The light in Thorne's window was a malevolent yellow eye staring back at him through the growing blizzard. He didn't have to wait long. The front door was thrown open, and the two small figures were violently shoved out into the maelstrom. This time there was no pretense. Jedediah didn't just lock the door behind them. He hurled a curse into the wind, a sound swallowed by the storm's fury, but felt by Elias in his very soul. Lyra and Alara stumbled, their thin coats instantly plastered with snow. They huddled against the wall, but there was no shelter there. The wind tore at them from all directions, a relentless, physical assault. Elias's blood ran cold. This was no longer neglect. This was a death sentence. In that moment, something inside Elias Vance snapped. The careful politician, the measured mayor, the man who weighed every action, was gone. In his place was a primal force of protective fury. He pulled on his heaviest greatcoat, grabbed the solid iron poker from his fireplace, and walked out of his office, not bothering to lock the door behind him. The wind hit him like a solid wall, stealing his breath and stinging his eyes. The short distance across the street felt like a treacherous Arctic expedition. Snow blinded him, ice crunched under his boots, and the roar of the blizzard was a deafening chaos. But his focus was absolute. He saw the girls, their small forms already disappearing under a blanket of white, their shivering having subsided into a dangerous, deathly stillness. He reached them and knelt, putting a hand on each of their shoulders. Their bodies were rigid, their faces pale and almost blue in the swirling snow. Alara's eyes were closed, but Lyra looked up at him, a flicker of recognition in her gaze before it dimmed again. "It's all right," he roared over the wind, the words torn from his lips. "I've got you." He scooped them up, one in each arm. They were terrifyingly light, like birds made of hollow bone. Turning his back to the wind, he carried them not to his own house, but straight to Jedediah Thorne's front door. He didn't knock. He kicked. The wood shuddered but held. He kicked again, putting all his grief, all his rage, all his despair into the blow. The lock splintered, and the door flew inward with a crash. He stepped into the oppressive warmth of the house, the girls held tight against his chest. Jedediah was sitting at his table, a bottle of whiskey in front of him, a look of pure shock on his face that quickly curdled into rage. "Vance, what is the meaning of this? You've broken into my home," he bellowed, rising to his feet. Elias carefully set the girls down near the weak fire in the hearth, pulling the thin, wet coats from their frozen bodies. "Your home," Elias said, his voice a low, dangerous growl he didn't recognize as his own. He advanced on Thorne, the iron poker held loosely at his side. "This isn't a home. It's a tomb. And you are not a father. You are a monster." Thorne lunged for a rifle mounted on the wall, but Elias was faster. He moved with a speed born of righteous fury, shoving Thorn hard against the wall. The rifle clattered to the floor. "They are children," Elias hissed, his face inches from Thorn's. "My children," Thorn spat back, his eyes wild with a mix of fear and defiance. "My property. The law says so." Elias pressed the cold iron of the poker against Thorn's chest. "Tonight, the law is silent," he said, his voice shaking with the force of his emotion. "Tonight, there is only justice. You will not touch these girls again. You will not speak their names. You will pack your things and be gone by sunrise. If I ever see your face in this town again, I will not be the mayor. I will be the man who buries you." The fight went out of Jedediah Thorn. In the face of Elias's absolute conviction, his petty tyranny crumbled. He saw not a politician, but an executioner of a judgment long overdue. He simply nodded, his face ashen. Elias backed away slowly, never taking his eyes off the man. He gathered the two girls, wrapping them in a dry, albeit dirty, blanket from Thorn's bed. As he carried them out the door and back into the storm, he didn't look back. He was leaving the cold behind and carrying the future in his arms. The blizzard raged for 2 more days, cocooning Prosperity Gulch in a world of white silence. Inside the mayor's residence, a different kind of world was being born. Elias, with the help of Martha the baker, who had braved the storm as soon as she heard the commotion, nursed the girls back to health. They had been on the very edge of freezing, their small bodies exhausted and their spirits nearly extinguished. For the first day, they did little more than sleep, curled together in Elias's own bed, buried under a mountain of quilts. Elias sat in a chair beside them, watching the gentle rise and fall of their chests, a vigil he hadn't been able to keep for his own daughter. The ghosts of his past were not banished, but they were quieter now, making room for the living. Martha bustled around the house, her presence a whirlwind of practical warmth. She filled the space with the smell of chicken soup and baking bread, her soft humming a gentle counterpoint to the howling wind outside. She spoke to the girls in soothing tones, asking nothing of them, simply offering comfort and care. When the storm finally broke, the sun glinted off a world transformed, pristine and beautiful. So, too, was the world inside the mayor's house transformed. Alara and Lyra slowly began to thaw, not just from the cold, but from the fear that had encased them for so long. The first time Lyra spoke, her voice was a tiny, hesitant whisper. "Is he gone?" she asked, looking at Elias with wide, questioning eyes. Elias knelt down so he was at her level. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He's gone, and he's never coming back. You are safe now." A single tear traced a path down Alara's cheek. It was the first tear Elias had ever seen either of them shed. It was a tear not of sadness, but of release. News of that night traveled quickly through the thawed-out town. Jedediah Thorn had vanished, his house left empty and cold. There were whispers, questions, but when people saw the twin girls, holding Elias's hands as they walked down the main street, they understood. They saw the new light in the girls' eyes, the tentative smiles that began to grace their lips. They saw the profound change in their mayor, the deep lines of sorrow on his face softened by a new, fierce purpose. The town, which had once turned a blind eye, now opened its arms. Martha became a surrogate grandmother, teaching the girls to bake and braiding their moon-white hair. The schoolteacher spent extra time with them, marveling at their sudden eagerness to learn. The community, shamed by its inaction, now sought to make amends, weaving a net of kindness and support around this new, unconventional family. Spring arrived, melting the snow and coaxing green shoots from the hard ground. The change was miraculous. Lyra's quiet defiance blossomed into a confident curiosity, while Alara's fearful watchfulness transformed into a gentle, artistic sensitivity. They laughed. The sound of their laughter, clear and bright, was the most beautiful sound Elias had ever heard. He was no longer just the mayor, he was a father. He had not replaced the child he had lost, but he had honored her memory by saving these two. He had found redemption not in a charter or a law book, but in the warmth of a small hand slipping into his. Where does a town's responsibility end and a neighbor's begin? At what point does the letter of the law become an excuse for moral cowardice? We build walls around our homes and our families, and we tell ourselves that what happens behind a neighbor's closed door is not our concern. But is it true? When you hear a cry in the night, or see a shadow of injustice in a window, do you pull your own curtains tighter? Or do you light a lamp? The world can be a cold and unforgiving place, much like that winter in Prosperity Gulch. But the story of Elias, Elara, and Lyra teaches us that the warmest fires are not built in a hearth, but in the human heart. It is the fire of courage, the fire of compassion, the fire of a community that refuses to let its most vulnerable freeze in the dark. It proves that the strongest families are not always bound by blood, but are forged in the crucible of shared struggle and unconditional love. What injustices are happening on your street, in your town, right outside your window? And what are you going to do about it? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more tales of courage and the enduring power of the human spirit.